Don't allow them to confuse you or frustrate you, because it's when that syndrome starts that individuals who are highly intelligent, who know their craft the best, start to really double talk and not make sense, to the point where it's questionable whether they really know their job or not.
Beyond Clean offers a creative look into the inner workings of the healthcare industry, committed to getting it right every instrument, every time. Join us every week as we explore the hidden world of one of the most important aspects of safe surgical care. And now your hosts, Michael Matthews, Hank Balch, and Justin Poulin.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Barbara Harmar, Director of Clinical Services at Innovative Sterilization Technologies, LLC. Barbara is a highly skilled, knowledgeable, and visionary perioperative nursing leader with over 36 years of administrative and clinical management and internal and external consulting experience in both inpatient, outpatient, and multi-campus healthcare facilities. She's the founder and president of MedAssist Consultants Incorporated, a highly respected and experienced consulting company, and has been for over 28 years. She successfully provided medical and surgical consulting services to over 300 clients nationally and internationally. She has a demonstrated record with increasing challenging healthcare leadership positions and is a sought-after speaker for local, regional, and national symposiums and conventions. We had Barbara as part of our panel at our first ever event at ISHM's 2018 annual conference and expo this year. For those of you who enjoyed our packaging method myth-busting panel discussion, you either saw it in person or you listened to the two-part episodes here on the podcast. I think you're going to enjoy Barbara's deep dive into Surveying the Surveyor is essentially what we've titled it, where Barbara has vast experience as a surveyor. We're going to give you some insights in a two-part podcast. We've had one topic before on Joint Commission surveys. It was one of our very successful podcasts to date. Now we're going to give you some tips and tricks from the surveyor herself. So really excited to get into this one.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Justin. This is always a topic that people are hungry for. And if you haven't ever been a part of a survey before, I can tell you that there are a few things that cause such a flurry of panic and anxiety as getting ready for that survey and then the day when they actually walk in the door. And so anything that we can give people to be prepared for that moment is really valuable knowledge and experience that will pay off large dividends when that day inevitably comes.
All right, well, before we get started, just a reminder to everybody how you can find us, not only on social media, but we would really appreciate it if you subscribe to Beyond Clean, either on iTunes or Stitcher. And also, we recently added the Beyond Clean podcast on Google Play and Spotify. So you simply need to search for Beyond Clean podcast on any of those applications, and also try on your favorite podcast app on your phone. We can also be heard on the Sterile Education app. That's available on iTunes and Android. And follow us on Twitter at Beyond Clean Info, Facebook.com/Beyond Clean Podcast, LinkedIn.com/company/Beyond Clean, the Instagram page where you can submit pictures anonymously to share with all of our listening audience, or just go and look at them yourself, Beyond Clean Podcast. Finally, if you do want to share that picture on Instagram, or if you have a question or a topic for the show, simply send an email to info@beyondclean.net. We'll be right back with Barbara Harmar, Director of Clinical Services at Innovative Sterilization Technologies, LLC. Joining us now is Barbara Harmar, Director of Clinical Services at Innovative Sterilization Technologies, LLC. Barbara, it is nice to be speaking with you again. For anybody who hasn't listened to our two-part episode from the ISHM annual conference, we had our first ever panel discussion on packaging method myth-busting, and we're excited to have you back on as a guest for your own dedicated episode.
Thank you.
I think one of the things we want to get into is surveys, and definitely in segment 1, talking about typical accreditation surveys, etc. But maybe just talk a little bit about your background and experience as a surveyor.
Well, I was involved in the very early beginnings of ambulatory surgical centers, and at that point, back in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, I became a surveyor for the Association for the Accreditation of Ambulatory Healthcare, more commonly known as AAAHC Incorporated. And I started surveying back then and continued surveying for 24 years, and was one of the first surveyors in 1996 to begin doing CMS surveys when deemed status surveys were permitted by agencies other than the Department of Health. So I got to survey not only office-based and ambulatory surgical centers and college health centers and pretty much any walk of life that did not have an inpatient bed, I was able to survey. I was rather broad-based, and I had an excellent opportunity in that I was part of the educational team for AAAHC, and on a quarterly basis, there were educational seminars and sessions held where I would lead the entire group on quality management and improvement when most people really didn't understand what QI was, and it really didn't matter whether the acronym was QI, PI, TQM, it didn't matter, is my point. It's all revolving around the total complex picture of how do you become better in the vein of total quality management. So that's my background as a surveyor, and as I said, I traveled throughout the country and did it for 24 years.
Barbara, we know a little bit now about your background. What can you tell us about the background of, other surveyors? What's kind of the average or the normal background that we can expect a surveyor to have?
And, that's almost a multi-million-dollar question, in that you're not going to know who's going to appear on your doorstep. Most surveyors come from one, and sometimes their responsibilities might overlap in their home organization, but usually surveyors are either clinical or administrative, and then there's the blended version of an administrator who also happens to be clinical, which is the bill that I fit, since I am a nurse and yet was the administrator of many surgical centers throughout my career. So you would have those kinds of attributes, whether it be inpatient or outpatient, or even a combination. And so the clinical could be anyone that has a clinical background. It does not necessarily mean that it would only be a nurse in the specialty of which someone was surveying. So if there was a survey that was scheduled and a nurse was on the team, typically you would try to have, if it was someone that was coming to specifically, we'll say SPD, you would want to have a nurse who had a surgical services background or had an operating room background or a central supply background. But alas, that is not always the case. Many, many times, having been surveyed as well as being the surveyor, I have had personally and been on teams where nurses did not have that background and might be, for example, an intensive care unit trained nurse or an emergency room nurse. And so although matching is not perfected, matching is tried repeatedly, but there are occurrences where if you're in an ophthalmology-based facility, it's very possible that you could have a gastroenterologist conducting your survey.
I feel like it's not going out on much of a limb to assume that most surveyors probably don't come from SPD or have much of an SPD background. And if that being the case, what kind of training do surveyors receive before they go into an area that they're not familiar with?
And so when the team, because it's usually never an individual, 20 years ago, there were many surveys that were conducted by one individual. Those days are pretty much gone. So you usually have a team of surveyors, which could be according to, again, based on the size and the complexity of your organization. You could have a team of 2, 3, 4, 5 coming to your facility. So the way that, first of all, let me put it out there, because it's been the call of the wild with me for my entire career, and that is we have many, many individuals who are surveyors who might even be surgical services in the sense that they've been in the operating room for X number of years, 15 years, 10 years, 20 years, it doesn't matter the length of time. But yet they don't have a background in SPD. And so this has always been a problem area where I've been concerned, not only on surveys, but in fact directing survey teams. And so every nurse, technicians are not part of the survey team. So you would not have a central supply technician who might be the manager of an SPD in a health system on the team. However, if you have a nurse, and there are more and more nurses now that are being put in charge of SPD departments, if you have a nurse and that nurse went through education and training to become a surveyor, it's possible that in very few instances you might be lucky enough to get a nurse that has that specific background. And so I can tell you about 15 years ago when I was still surveying, I went to our organization and said, we're doing an injustice to organizations because it's not okay to go into an SPD and look and say, oh, you have a sterilizer. Oh, do you have a logbook? Oh, okay. And many a physician, they were pretty much the extent of the questions that were asked. It's only been in the last 15 years that surveyors have been given infection control courses. They've been given some sterilization, nothing like the people that work in the trenches every day, but some education which is enough to make them dangerous, as I like to say. And I will tell you that today, because of the emphasis in the last 5 to 8 years with CMS and the Department of Health in many states, surveyors are being armed with an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper that will tell them what some of the highlights are that they should be looking for. And if they kind of go off script, then they're in a no man's land because they are not adequately trained in the respect of what a current staff member in SPD lives on a daily basis.
So, Barbara, talking about that highlight sheet that you mentioned and kind of bringing this down to the frontline technician perspective, if I'm a technician and I see surveyors coming in the front door, I may be asking myself, what is their purpose for being here? Kind of outside even the SPD level, maybe at the hospital system level, et cetera, but why are these guys coming into my department of all the departments in the hospital? And when they get there, what are they going to be focusing on or looking at, as you said, that little cheat sheet maybe that gives them those surveying highlights?
So the first thing a surveyor in coming into any department will have already done their homework is knowing what the deficiencies were from a previous survey. That's very important because throughout their tour of the department, throughout their questioning, one of the answers that they need to provide in their survey report form will be how you corrected the deficiency, because that's already been submitted right as part of your deficiencies 3 years prior, let's say. And so they're going to ask, how this was your deficiency, how did you correct this? So it's very timely for you to understand what happened the last time the specific department was surveyed by a team. Then, of course, they're going to be looking for, did your answer that you provided, is it still being adhered to, followed, or is there a different avenue that you've gone down because of either non-compliance, or perhaps there's been a change in the industry, and from one survey to the next, this could be happening from the time the deficiency correction was presented to the accrediting organization. That, I would tell you, is one of the areas of focus. No matter what, they're going to be always looking at what did this department, what did, for example, SPD have in their deficiency list from the prior survey. Beyond that, it's fair game to talk to anyone at all in the department. And so usually people will begin to freak when they see the touring group come through the department, and I'm here to tell you that should not be the reaction. And the best thing to do is to try to train staff ahead of time that, by the way, this is going to happen. If it's an unannounced survey, the door is going to open at some point and somebody's going to come in. However, if it's an announced survey, then we can plan for it even more specifically because we'll know the days and the times that someone will be coming to the organization. But where the primary purpose is concerned is it really should be on a sharing expedition as opposed to, as I like to say, taking the hatchet out and trying to find someone's neck to bury it in. And so that caring and sharing should be, the manager, the director, whatever the level of that particular department might be, should be very proud to show off what, in fact, is going on in the SPD department. And so that covers the whole breadth and depth of what you do normally on a daily basis in an SPD.
Yeah, Barbara, I'm glad you mentioned that you do not need to scatter and run when you see the door open with the surveyors. I have seen that in a context of a leader, and then also way back when I was a frontline technician, and I felt the horror and the nervousness of these strangers with clipboards coming in to what I thought, as you said, looking for problems and issues, when really it is an opportunity to show off and to speak to all the good things that you've been doing as a department. So, to that point, I'd like to know, as a leader, but then also as frontline staff, is it our responsibility to really guide that conversation in the department, or should we follow the surveyor's lead as they walk around and ask questions of our processes and our policies?
And I appreciate that question because actually I'm going to give you a non-answer because it really is situational. And the situational portion of it is it's really all about the individual and that person's comfort zone. And so for me, I am an extremely assertive person. So I would take the lead and I would want to rise and shine and show off everything that I possibly could because it's my department and it's my time to put all of our best foots forward, if you will. Did you like the foots rather than feet? But it really is because it shows the amounts of teamwork and again, that's who I am. However, there are many individuals out there that will be, very shy, introverted, and would want to run for the corner, even though we just discussed that maybe that would not be the way that you would want to do it, because that can be seen in a negative vein by the surveyors, because let's face it, all the surveyors are human. And so, yes, you can follow their lead, but the important thing is if you're going to follow their lead, make sure that you're going down a road that you know is factual, not opinion-based. And so if you're going to do that, then just make sure that you stay on topic, make sure that you stay in the right lane. Don't go out of your lane and drive in a lane that they might want to take you. Don't allow them to confuse you or frustrate you, because it's when that syndrome starts that individuals who are highly intelligent, who know their craft the best start to really double talk and not make sense and lose it to the point where it's questionable whether they really know their job or not. And in fact, they've been allowed to go down that street because they decided to follow. So my opinion would be that you should want to lead the conversation. But again, I'm comfortable in my own skin, and I would want to do that. However, there will be individuals that will go the other way.
Well, you bring up a great point, too, is on the one hand, you can listen to this interview and be very inspired to prepare your team and yourself, if you're a manager, to have the survey and be ready. And again, I think any time in life, the confidence that you exude has a big impact on the experience that you have with just about anything. But then at the same time as we talk about this, there's a little bit of a wild card effect there. And so people can also be anxious or a little uneasy. And I'm not just talking about the manager as far as preparing themselves, but maybe some recommendations that you could share with managers on how to prepare their teams for having somebody who might possibly be intimidating and is definitely a stranger coming in the department and asking them questions about their day-to-day. And not everybody on the team is always so confident, especially when they're being questioned. Do you have any ways that managers and supervisors alike can prepare the team for the survey itself?
Sure. I think the first item that should be addressed is that if it's a good survey, and usually individuals understand whether it's a good survey or a bad survey as soon as the door opens. And if it's a good survey, then the surveyor or the survey team that's coming into the department should express themselves that way. I can tell you, in my past, I used to walk into a department, have a big smile on my face, and say, I'm here to hear all about your department, and hopefully when we're done, you're going to learn something from me, and I'm going to learn something from you. That's part of that caring and sharing. However, there are other individuals that will come in and totally try to intimidate the people that are there. So from a managerial or a supervisory perspective, I would want individuals to know that ultimately the goal of the organization who's having this survey conducted is to make us better. And I think you need to put the positive spin on it. The second thing I would do, though, right off the bat, is to tell everybody that even if the person does not have their facts straight, or the survey team is making a mess out of what they're asking, and they're jumbled and they're all over the place, you should never disrespect somebody. It's honorable to still be respectful. That doesn't mean that you can't be assertive, and that certainly doesn't mean that you can't challenge the surveyor. I want to go back to that, but before I go there, let me just go back, because a true essential ingredient to all of this that staff members as well as managerial staff need to understand is that you need to be a good listener. Listen to what the surveyor or survey team is asking you. Do not get diarrhea of the mouth and start talking about something else. You want to answer the question that's being asked. Do not go down a sideline and give them an answer about something else that's going on or something else that's happening. If they are not happy with the answer that you give them to a question, they will pursue it and ask an additional question. In the same vein, if you have a question asked of you, managerial, staff member, doesn't matter. If you have a question and you're not sure of the answer, it's okay to say, I'm sorry, I'm not understanding your question. Can you rephrase it for me? Because I might know your answer, but I'm not sure what you're asking. That shows some humility, but it also shows that you're not cowardly backing away and running. And then again, if a question is asked of a staff member, and let's say it's an organizational or management question that is not in that person's sphere of job responsibility, then that person also should be trained to say, I'm sorry, I don't have the answer for that, but I can go to Jack or I can go to Mary, and I'm sure that they'll be able to provide the answer for you. And that shows a lot of control of the situation. But I wanted to go back to, the respect and being polite. That has nothing to do with challenging someone. If you're listening to something that you know is incorrect, there is a responsibility to set the record straight. And far too often individuals do not do that.
That's great advice, and you're right. You can be respectful, but you can stand your ground, and it especially helps if you can cite why you're right, but again, in a respectful way, not an I told you so. I can tell you we've talked about surveys on one other episode in the last year of Beyond Clean. It was one of our more popular ones. It's very clear to understand why it would be one of our more popular ones. I think there's a lot of good information. That was just our first segment, so there is going to be a part 2. Make sure you join us for that. And Barbara, I just wanted to say thank you, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again in the second segment.
Thank you.
That was Barbara Harmar, Director of Clinical Services at Innovative Sterilization Technologies, LLC. I think what I love about doing these interviews, Hank, is we just get some real takeaways, some good advice. Barbara did a very good job of that in this interview, where there's some techniques or skills that you can put, or any technician or manager or supervisor can put into practice literally right after listening to this podcast before their very next Joint Commission survey.
Yeah, great insight, Justin. I gotta say, I appreciated in particular the distinctions that she made between personalities in department leadership or even among the staff. I know, having been on both sides of that coin, not everyone is comfortable approaching those strangers with the bunny suits and the clipboards and sharing the story of patient safety of their department. Other folks, even though they know the answers and they know the story, they're more inclined to maybe step back, but I appreciated her insights on just how to prepare everyone across that spectrum to be confident, at the very least confident, and then you can roll with the flow depending on how that surveyor is, because that was another great point that she made, not all surveyors are created equal, and some will come in wanting to lead more, and then others will come in questioning more, so it really is one of those things. There's not a cookie cutter answer, besides the fact that it's very important to be prepared and confident among the whole team.
Yeah, and I referenced Joint Commission, but obviously there's a lot of accrediting bodies out there. And I think the other thing that she really talked about was you also have to know where they're coming from potentially. I would almost say it's not a bad idea to ask them what their experience is, because as she stated, not everybody comes from operating room experience or sterile processing experience, and I think knowing where the surveyor's coming from can definitely be a help, but sometimes they don't have the same experience as the person who's running the department that they're surveying. So think about that. Come from a position of confidence, just as you mentioned. Great tips. Looking forward to part 2. I know we're going to take an even deeper dive into expertise versus accreditation and some of the challenges in the surveying process. So make sure you join us for that one. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on iTunes and Stitcher, and now also on Google Play and Spotify. Simply search for Beyond Clean Podcast, and you'll be able to find us there. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review, as well as a subscribe, because your feedback is important to the show. If you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, or if you'd like to share a picture anonymously on our Instagram page, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank, Mike, and myself, thank you for listening to another edition of Beyond Clean.